Chapter 11. Roy Buchanan, Stevie Ray Vaughn, the Indigo Girls, and Doc Watson. Legends like Roy Buchanan. His music touched me for the first time in 1972, and I saw him perform several times. When offered the chance to interview Roy in 1975 for Atlanta's famed underground newspaper, The Great Speckled Bird, I jumped at it nervously. Very nervously. This man played from his soul and did things with his guitar that stirred me. I walked up to him before his show at Alex Cooley's Electric Ballroom and introduced myself, explaining why I was there. He very calmly and politely told me he'd be glad to talk to me and asked, "What are you drinking?" All of my uneasiness immediately disappeared. Roy and I began a close friendship that day. After the second show of that first night, I drove Roy and his manager, Jay Rich, back to their hotel. Roy and I talked about music and life in general until the crack of dawn. For the next 2 nights, Roy and Jay rode in my van to and from the gig. It was such a treat to watch Roy blow the roof off for 4 more shows. This was equal to a 3-day-long guitar lesson for me. Back at the hotel, Roy told me of some of his primary influences. He showed me some of his guitar techniques. One of his signature songs was an instrumental version of Don Gibson's Sweet Dreams. His favorite version was by Farron Young, and that I should look it up. He told me about a guitarist named Jimmy Bryant who played psychedelic music in the 50s. Roy also spoke of the writings of Bukowski. He ran the gambit and revealed his spiritual side too and his love for his family. He didn't want to go on the road very often in order to stay close to home. He loved his children. Roy was very full of life, and he had a lot to live for. It wasn't long before I began to sense a somewhat troubled and restless side of Roy. As with most of us, he also struggled. He confessed to me that he didn't relate to the world in general, and that he always felt like he would be better off living on his own planet. The Rolling Stones asked him to join them, and he declined. Roy did not want to be another Brian Jones. To use his words, he did not want to be the next casualty. He always had a type of sad, sensitive look in his eyes. It gave me the impression that he was searching for something and that he was having a difficult time finding it. I regularly dropped everything to go hang out with Roy whenever he appeared in Atlanta. He opened up to me about his experiences in the 50s and 60s, his musical ideas, and more. Roy had a simple formula for music. He played songs he liked, the way he liked. He played for himself, but was always visibly pleased when his music made someone happy. Roy focused on one person at a time in an audience, whether it was a few hundred or a few thousand. He did it to me many times. When I showed up too late at the Omni Coliseum in Atlanta to catch Roy's show with the Jefferson Starship, but in time to ride with him to his hotel, he said there were several individuals in the crowd that night that caught his attention. He played to each one as well as the whole crowd. It's no doubt those people knew. That same night, he let me play his famous blonde 53 Fender Telecaster with the huge frets. When Roy came back in early 1978 to perform at the Great Southeast Music Hall, a great venue located in the far corner of a strip mall in North Atlanta, I called Jack Tarver, the general manager, to find out where he was staying. It turned out that Roy was snowed in back in Virginia and could not make the show. Jack knew me since his kids were my guitar students and asked me if I would like to sub for Roy in his show. Of course I thought he was kidding. As it was, he was very serious. This had to be kept under wraps. If word of this got out, there would be guitar players parachuting into the parking lot by the hundreds. Soon, fate had me headed for the stage instead of the audience. A call to the band at their hotel put things in motion quickly. Roy's drummer, Bird Foster, was already in town and ready for the gig. He and the band planned to play, Roy or no Roy. The show must go on. Bird asked me if I had my guitar available. A silly question. He might as well have asked if I had my heart with me. The guitar was one thing ever present then and would be for as long as I draw breath. Question asked, question answered. Roy was snowbound, and I was stagebound. I plugged my guitar into a rented amplifier and went through a 15-minute crash rehearsal in the dressing room with Roy's band. The Beatles, Slow Down, Neil Young's Down by the River were some of Roy's favorites, along with a few others, and it was showtime. The audience had come to see Roy Buchanan. No surprise. They were already told that Roy wasn't there, and some folks had gotten their money back. Some stayed, though, and we weathered the storm together, including a whole group of my own guitar students on the front row. I took a deep breath and then hit the stage with Roy's band. Of course, one does not go on stage with Roy Buchanan's band and try to be Roy Buchanan. My focus would be on trying to do what Roy would have done, have fun. His band was exceptional. The crowd was great, and that night we received 2 encores. Sometimes snowstorms bring forever, and forever arrived that night thanks to a rented amplifier and people that saw a band play on, with me where Roy usually played. Roy arrived in Atlanta the next night, and the band filled him in. Roy told me, "Roger, the first time I met you, I told you I loved you, man, and I still do. and I appreciate what you did. You really helped me out." Roy was important to me. So was his opinion of my playing. He inspired the guitar player and the man in me. This was a true highlight of my career. There would be more in later years, but at age 26, this would suffice for now. While commercial success eluded him, Roy Buchanan was a master blues, country, rockabilly guitarist. He played with the Dale Hawkins Band in the 50s and then worked with a group of musicians that became the band. Throughout the 70s and early 80s, Roy had a string of solo albums that sold well to a limited but devoted cult following of musicians like me. Roy and I stayed linked as friends do. Talks on the phone, plans to meet, shared nothings of everyday existences. The important right along with the mundane. As time does, the gaps in communication grew, and suddenly it was a few years since we last spoke. Life kept him in one place and me in others. The opportunity to open a show at the Moonshadow Saloon in Atlanta in 1985 for Billy Price and the Keystone Rhythm Band of Pittsburgh came into play. Billy had been Roy's vocalist on his live album. He told me of Roy's new album release on Alligator Records. My old friend and inspiration was doing well. The album was on my turntable the next day. Sadly, I was out of town when Roy did return to appear at the Center Stage Theater in Atlanta. It was one of his final appearances anywhere. I would later share this story with Alligator Records founder and CEO Bruce Iglauer. Bruce said that he had a great fondness for Roy. Iglauer went on to say that Roy treated me really considerately the whole time we worked together. Roy was found dead hanging in a Virginia jail cell on August 14, 1988. His death was ruled a suicide, but many doubts still remain, especially by his family. Roy Buchanan, known as the guitarist, was gone. As in most such tragedies, the details are vague and still in question. According to Newswire reports quoting authorities, Roy left his home during a domestic dispute and was arrested for disorderly conduct. On a positive note, Roy had a great sense of humor. When I asked him to write down some advice for me to give my guitar students, he simply wrote, quote, "Don't believe Roger, Roy Buchanan," unquote. Looking at that autograph still makes me laugh. August is when I remember him the most. He shows up in my music all the time. Another evening, as I was finishing up another day of teaching guitar, I received a phone call from Russell Shaw, then music reviewer for Atlanta's Creative Loafing magazine. While the exact date escapes me, I believe it was sometime in early 1980. He said for me to grab my guitar and get down to Atlanta's downtown cafe at the corner of Virginia and Highland Avenue. The only thing I knew on the way to the club was that I was going to meet Thunderbirds guitarist Jimmy Vaughn's little brother, later known as Stevie Ray Vaughn. What I really recall to this day was how wired Stevie was. He had been awake for days, wearing the same clothes. His body odor definitely reinforced that fact. He actually had duct taped his boots on the spot where they were wearing out. When I shook hands with him, he just shrugged me off as being another guitar player. He couldn't have cared less. We did get on stage together with me just trying to play along and compliment whatever he was doing. Stevie was very dominating and very loud, but that was okay. He was good, and he was obviously trying to become one with his guitar. As it turned out, while going without sleep, he was riding in the back of the van on the road playing his guitar. He would just stay awake and then carry his amp into the club with one hand while still having his guitar strapped on. Where his guitar case was would be anybody's guess. At the end of the night, he would carry his amp out and continue playing in the back of the van to the next destination. This night was no different. Since there were only a small number of people present, he was quite disgusted. He and his band were to play 2 nights, but as it was, they decided to pack up and leave that night. I do remember him saying out loud, "I just need to shut up and keep on playing." Upon saying that, he just went over to the dark side of the stage, sat down on his amp, and continued wailing. The visual of him sitting down with the classic SRV position of his head and hat down over his guitar is still with me to this day. That night, there was something really strange happening on the stage as he played. I couldn't help noticing these little flag-like things that appeared to be attached to the fingertips of his left hand. In the shadows on the stage, I kept trying to look to see what they were. While he was crouched on his amp playing, I walked over and took a close look at his left hand. These white inch or so long flag-looking things were actually the calluses from his fingers that had actually become detached but were still held on by superglue. This was mind-blowing. My desire in life had always been to be the best guitar player I could be, to play as much as I could, to eat, sleep, and breathe music. Becoming one with my instrument would be okay too, but this was more than I could take. I remember thinking to myself, this MF is crazy. This is where I draw the line. It was almost as if I felt sorry for him being consumed by this obsession. Obviously, he was destroying himself in trying to be the best guitar player in the world. The word was that night that they didn't have enough gas money to get back to Austin. They got back in the van, Stevie with guitar in hand, and headed out of the parking lot. I wished him good luck and to please travel safe. That night would be on my mind for quite a while. It was a real lesson and reminded me to keep my feet planted in the real world. The days that followed were a real reality check. After a period of time, Stevie Ray Vaughn obviously made his mark by recording with David Bowie, and then snubbing him to continue to play with his own band. A CD release or two with an appearance on Saturday Night Live with Mick Jagger in the mid-'80s would get the wheels turning. Mick had said he would only do SNL if they brought Stevie on to do the show with him. I was at a gig when I saw Stevie on TV that night, having been a witness to this guy that literally walked into the valley of the shadow of death. He was well on his way to stardom, and I was cheering for him inside. Stevie had been cleaning up his act in the late 80s, and it appeared that he would pull through. In 1990, while working my job at CNN, video of the helicopter crash that took his life started flooding in. Some of those reports are in my archive library. The writer of Stevie Ray's biography said that during his last performance in Iowa, that he was the best in the world that last night. Eric Clapton, Buddy Guy, and Robert Cray were all scared to get near him on stage on that final show. It appeared that he was only beginning to realize that there was more to life than just playing the guitar. In 1994, I ran into my friend and musician Tinsley Ellis at Buddy Guy's Legends in Chicago. T and I go way back to the 70s in Atlanta. While we were talking and catching up that night, he told me he remembered seeing me jam with Stevie Ray. I told him I really didn't remember what we played. He said he thought it was Little Wing. And then it all started coming back. It was Little Wing, in addition to some other freeform blues. Tinsley still tells that story to this day when the subject comes up. On the other end of the spectrum, there was another interaction with a musical act that occurred at the beginning of their lucrative career and didn't take a self-destructive path. Back in 1980, I was handling the booking for a restaurant in North Atlanta called Good Old Days. It was owned by a mother and daughter partnership. My job was to hire the musicians and take care of the calendar, making sure it reached the newspaper before the weekly deadline. Since I was busy teaching and performing regularly, I didn't have time to hang out at the venue to audition every act that would come through. I would send them to open mic on Mondays to do a short set, and then the management would tell me yay or nay. There were some good solo acts and duos that I would run through on a regular basis. There was this one day when I got a personal call from the manager raving about two high school girls that had auditioned and, according to her, sang like birds. So I hired them for a number of nights. A few days later, I got a call from the mother half of the partnership. She told me that since these girls were underage by law, they were not permitted to perform at Good Old Days. I did explain to her that there was legal forms that could be filled out to allow them to play, but she was adamant and didn't want to hear any part of it. Now I'm the bad guy, and it was up to me to call these girls and be the bearer of bad news. As I explained to one of the girls on the phone that it wasn't my decision, Emily simply said, "Thank you anyway, Mr. Wilson. We'll see you in a few years." And no truer words were ever spoken. They did show up again a few years later, taking the world by storm. I was reading a full-page spread about them in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. They were now the Indigo Girls, and to think that a few years earlier I had fired them. It made me proud to see them make good on their promise in a big way. 10 years later, in 1990, while playing a gig in Macon, Georgia, I was staying at a motel on Riverside Drive. While in the parking lot placing some items in the small equipment trailer I was towing with my pickup truck, a huge tour bus made a slow entrance into the parking lot. It was the Indigo Girls coming to Macon to play a street festival. As we stood around talking, I jokingly asked if they remembered the time I fired them. They did remember the incident, and we laughed about it. I told them that they seemed to have recovered well and was proud of them. You can't make this stuff up. Having always been in love with the guitar, there were other pilgrimages, or maybe just a desire to get close to great players. It wasn't always about electric guitar players. There were also efforts to get close to the artisans of the wood. The legendary Doc Watson was one. Through my love of the guitar, I've always been interested in electric, acoustic, and classical guitar styles. There were a few Doc Watson records that I had scratched up along the way in trying to learn his style. When I went into Atlanta's Great Southeast Music Hall in 1975 to meet Doc, I was quite nervous. At age 22, I was a proficient enough guitarist to play on stage and teach for a living, but still quite naive on so much. Aside from my insecurities, I was always hungry to learn more. Upon meeting Doc Watson, even though he was blind, he could sense my nervousness. Being the gentleman that he was, he proceeded to put me right at ease. We talked about his flat-picking style, with his telling me that the down-up stroke used to flat-pick fast melodies must be taught from the very beginning. Later in his show, he took a moment to dedicate a song to me from the stage. This really helped to boost my overall confidence in myself, since there were so many times early in my career when I felt I wasn't worthy. Not too long after my visit with Doc, I attempted to learn one of his songs called Doc's Guitar. This song utilizes his fluent, finger-picking style. In listening to the song closely, I couldn't figure out but a few notes. Instead of ruining another record, out of frustration, I just decided to put the album away. About 25 years later, I listened to the song again, realizing that Doc had his guitar capoed at the 3rd fret. Having acquired all of those years of additional playing, teaching, and professional experience definitely made my learning process much easier. I finally recorded my own version of Doc's guitar on my 2006 Blue Storm Records CD, The Way I Am. After all of these years, I'm still trying to get it right. About the same time that CD was recorded, Doc Watson and I were signed to the same music distribution company. Unfortunately, I never did get to speak to him again, but I did communicate to him through his family about our meeting 40 years earlier, thanking him for inspiring me early in my career. Once again, these were just some of the great experiences that the music made happen.